So Tuesday morning was one of those days where the world breaks your heart a dozen times before you even get out the door to run. It was a lot of mental health crises with people in our church from 20 really all the way up to 80. And that feeling, you know, where someone is falling and everyone is trying to reach out their hand and break the fall, or if you can't break the fall, to try to get them the mattress down on the ground to keep them from shattering. So from that, I ran, and then I went to the Torah study. For the last 6-7 years, I've gathered with the same group of colleagues, a couple of rabbis, there's a few pastors, we're white, we're black, we're all long haulers in ministry. And we gathered there on Tuesday morning at this little sidewalk cafe, and all of us in the exact same place, with congregations, just hearts broken open, situations that we've really never seen before, just going on in this relentless way. And our friend Wallace was the last to arrive. Wallace has been through it. He's the wisest, the strongest, the most committed of anyone I know. He lost his father, the kind of storied civil rights leader of our community, just before COVID, thankfully, so the whole city could have a series of week-long celebrations for Dr. Hartsfield. And he just lost his mother quite unexpectedly earlier this month. She was really the source and ground of his being. And we all wept together, we suffered together. He's not an unstrong person. I remember a year or so ago, he had lost count if he buried 27 or 28 or 29 young men from gunshot wounds in the last year or so. But when one suffers, we all suffer, right? And when one weeps, we all weep. And I thought about a poem by a young woman named Carla Cordero that's become one of my favorites. She describes herself as a person of the Chichimeca people, northern Mexico. She's Chicana, she's a prophet, she's a pastor, she's a poet, she's an artist, she's an activist, she's a professor out at college in California. And she wrote this poem in which she compares her life to a house. Everything needs fixing. In your 30s, everything needs fixing. I bought a toolbox for this and filled it with the equipment my father once owned to keep our home from crumbling. I purchased tools with names and functions unknown to me, how they sat there on the shelf in plastic packaging with price tags screaming, "Hey lady, you need this." She goes on trying to imagine this home she could create where she could give immortality to her father and everyone who lived there. She said she had become absolutely obsessed with death and dying and trying to protect everyone she loved during COVID. But what she ended up with instead was a whole bunch of tools she had no idea how to use, and a drill with a million parts she couldn't possibly ever understand. What she ended up with instead was one thing she was certain of, that she had no idea what tools she could use to save the aging pet or the dying plant, to tend to the crow's feet under her eyes, or the stiff knee or the hurt back. Everything needs fixing. I mean, isn't that the truth? But maybe it's not the last word. Cordero's poem has become one of my favorite. I was looking for it to send it to a friend, but when I Googled it, what came up instead was another poem by another woman of color, Maxine Beniba Clark, Australian of Afro-Caribbean descent, entitled, "Nothing Here Needs Fixing." There is nothing here needs fixing. Black-eyed pea Monday nights, Jamaica bun, spiced rice pudding, mild mama love. Love lives here. Though things are tight, if these walls could talk, they'd stand tall and say there have been dark nights and even darker days, but only tenderness was ever spoken. And she goes on, broken home? Nuh-uh. There is nothing here that needs fixing. So which is it? Is it that everything needs fixing? Or is it that this is how it is, how it's meant to be, and there is really nothing here that needs fixing? Or is it that all the stuff that needs fixing is what drives us to our deepest core? to find the gift of who we are. And what finally calls us outward to reach out and to touch others that we love. Long before these young women of color whose voices we're finally hearing began to speak, there were old white guys speaking too. Some good ones, like my dear friend Bob Mesley, who taught for years and has written so powerfully about suffering, that reminder that about whether we suffer, there's no choice, but whether we suffer alone or together, we have all the choice, right? And he quotes Daniel Day Williams, born in 1910, professor at University of Chicago, who's written so much on suffering, another great process thinker. A man before him, Henry Nelson Wyman, born in 1884, who once said that the most critical thing, something that you always find at the heart of any creative community, is suffering. And Daniel Day Williams said he spent 50 years thinking about that. Is suffering always a part of a creative community? Is it necessarily? And Williams went on to think, and we could too, about all of the things that come from suffering, not necessarily, but that can come from suffering, right? There's certainly a deep identification. There's a knowing who you are and a knowing who another person is. I mean, the reality is, if you don't know how I've suffered, you really don't know me. I mean, that's part of the reason I'll bring it up now. 10 years ago, I lost 21 years of my life. I mean, it was like the Olympic gold medal, everything I pursued. And the reason I bring it up sometimes is because that's how I want you to know me. I want you to know that even though I haven't lost the exact same things you've lost, I've had the moment of falling when people were reaching out, right, trying to grab me, trying to keep me from splattering everywhere. And I know that's nothing compared to someone who has lost a child. I go to the store and you see the little spots, for pregnant mothers, and I think they should have spots there always for anyone who's lost a child, right there by the door. Almost that there should be a tattoo, like if you've lost a child, it's such a huge thing, right? It's such a part of your identity. In some ways, like Vietnam vets, right? The ones who are in the depth of combat are now our brothers and sisters who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. That part of who you are, it's the part that allows you to reach deep and to be honest. And it's the part, too, that pushes us to connect. That's another thing that suffering can bring, is deep connection. So if you've ever been to an AA group, right, or an open AA group, or any kind of disorder group, or if you've ever suffered from cancer, you've been at the march, right, and you've turned the corner, and you've looked and you've seen all those pink t-shirts. You're not alone, right? You're there. Or the purple shirts, or whatever the color shirt is. That's why we identify. That's why the VFW hall still got the old guys in it, right? Because that suffering creates some kind of connection that nothing else ever can. And then it's also the truth that it's suffering that pushes us to find healing. That's why the scientists are in the lab, right? That's why people are doing cancer research. His great uncle died from glioblastoma, and he's going to find the answer. Healing, the need for healing, the suffering. That's the reason the activists are in the street, right? That's the reason Casey Tenants is knocking on doors trying to get affordable housing. Suffering can push us out of ourselves to find healing and solutions and answers. The little house at 36th and Bales was full of all of that. Identity and connection and healing. Carolyn's house of faithful, sober living. I had gone there for Dan Mclean's birthday lunch, so to speak. We were going to celebrate Dan's birthday, and I had been trying to find a time, safe place we could gather, have a meal, grab something outside, pick him up at the law office. Maybe we'd grab Michelle too on the way. She's down there at the IRS. But Dan wanted me to go to Carolyn's house with him. As an attorney, he had done some work, helping them come up with a title cleared to one of the houses. Carolyn Whitney was one of those people who in 2014 decided to step aside from Blue Cross Blue Shield and start a home. Now there are 3 homes where women in recovery, needing healing and suffering could go. If you know the neighborhood, you know it's a house with a lot of houses that need fixing, right? Lovely home, drug house, lovely home, drug house. It's like every old house, really. I mean, my house, 115 years old. At some point, you just keep the list going of everything need fixing. Even if you're brand new to a house, you have that little punch list, right, that you think someday will be fixed and the house will be just as it should be. When you walked up to this place, you knew there was going to be something special. I confess it was a Friday, and Fridays are my lockdown in the sermon mode, and I've been to a lot of transitional houses like this, but Dan wanted me to go. It was important to him. As a man, he knew kind of rather than go in there and possibly be disrespectful of the women and their suffering, he wanted someone else with him. What an honor. When we walked into the home, the beautiful, beautiful way it was decorated, it just said love and radiance and beauty. It's really impossible to describe, but let me just say that if God had a lap, it would be Carolyn. She was that kind of a person that you just felt you could walk in there and just let it all out, right? Just be as honest as you could be without any judgment. And then there was Michelle. Michelle, I don't really remember the details, always go away, but she'd been on the street, she'd come up in a good home, but somehow there had been drug use and then incarceration, and then when she came out of incarceration, she was back on the street, going down the wrong path, until somehow she found her way into Carolyn's big home, the Serenity House, where women who've been incarcerated or homeless or on the street come in, and the first thing that happens is wraparound services, right, that help them think about what needs fixing and how we can begin to address it. Michelle was just radiant. She's one of those people, she reminded me of Ellie, loves to decorate. She can find anything for 50 cents. That home was gorgeous. 2 years into it now, she's leading the program at that house. She's a bakery manager. She's connected again with her 26-year-olds. And the longer we sat there, enjoying our lunch, relishing the time of communion, the shorter the list of what needed fixing seemed to be, and the longer the list of support. It was a giant white marker board, names and phone numbers right there in the home. So many I already knew. And across from it, a scripture, a lesson we were going to hear that Sunday from Ephesians 4, those beautiful words, right, about love and tenderness, about forgiving, those words about compassion. It has to be what? For ourselves and for others. And the longer we sat there feasting, the more I could imagine my name on that marker board, right? Someone broken and someone here ready to fix too. It was that kind of a moment, right? That holy, sacred moment where the lines between Dan and Caroline fell away. The lines between Holly and Michelle started to blur. That kind of a moment where no one could argue. Pretty much everything needs fixing, right? But if those walls could speak, they would say, love lives here. Compassion lives here. Only tender words are spoken here. They would say forgiveness and new starts and hope and joy live here. They would say to us, finally, in God's good heart, nothing is ever finally broken. Amen.